Hi, here's a overview of how the files to make the data table integration with web2py, how they all fit together. I will try to be quick. There's quite a few files, unfortunately. This is the main file, so this is the only view file really. So in views, data table, show HTML. It doesn't do much, doesn't seem to do much. It extends the main layout. I extend a different layout, but that's just the default layout. It has a placeholder for where you want the table to go. It loads a whole pile of files, which we will look at next. And then there is a short script that receives the DT settings object from the controller and then passes that object along with the placeholder into the JavaScript function to initialize that particular table. So here we've only got one table, but there's no reason why you can't have any number of tables here. You just need an extra div. You need an extra object returned from the controller, and of course you need to initialize them. But apart from that, it's pretty simple. So a few extra lines of code to get any number of tables that you want. There's a lot of files that come from files.load. I use this method because in files.load we've got using the web2py URL function. So if I load them this way using this method, I can utilize the web2py functionality. If I just reference this file, then I can't use this functionality, and that makes me sad. So that's why I've done it this way. The files here, this common JS has just got some common functions that I use, only a few, and there's no reason why they need to sit there. Just pull them out and put them in, or remove them entirely if you find them. They're just stuff that makes life a bit easier for me. This handles all of the formatting of the table itself. So there are things that I didn't like about the standard data tables, which I've changed. The padding and miscellaneous other things I've manipulated. So there's quite a few changes in that file. Then all of this is from data tables. So if you visit this website, right there, click visit that website, you can download these. I think you can bundle them all up into a single file. You can get additional files which essentially provide additional functionality for data tables. So a lot of the functionality is not built into the base data table JavaScript file and probably CSS as well. They will come as additional extensions or plugins, so you can keep data tables as lean as you want it. So I've got all the things that I need for this implementation. You could potentially remove some of these if you're not using them, but I think you probably want the responsive. The select, I think, allows you to do selection, multi-select, or single select. The buttons are the things that appear at the top. So there's probably not a lot of things actually that you can remove here. This is the main JavaScript file that does all the front end stuff. So this is the stuff that I've written, and we'll look at that briefly. This is something that is mentioned in the book, in the web2py book. It's a really cool multi-select control, which is now no longer being maintained, but it works great still, and I like it. I'll show you that in a moment. And then this stuff here, you probably can remove. I've left it in because it shows how to call a dialog from within the existing dialog and kind of pass some stuff back. So I wanted an image selector, which I might as well show now. First of all, this is the fancy multi-select thing control. So you just click on them and it moves them across, and then you can move them back, and it's really nice. Otherwise, I've got this huge long list and try and using them the way that the standard built-in multi-select works is just not practical. So this works really good. And then this is the image selector. So I've got my own widget here, which is the media selector, and then we can select an item. This has got some other stuff in it, it can be whatever you want it to be. And then choose your item, and it sends it back and does its thing. So that extra dialog, here's one dialog, but the extra dialog that we just saw is what we were looking at here, that image selector dialog. So again, if you're not using that widget, then you don't need that, and that could disappear. Okay, this is the JavaScript file that does all the fancy stuff on the front end. Essentially, it just receives a, scrolling up a little here, it receives the DT settings object from the controller. So all the stuff that, all the properties get saved to the DT settings, along with all the data gets saved into this object. And then this object is used to set, well, that line there actually puts in the table itself, the HTML table with all the data. And then this here is where the data table reads that table that we just dropped in from that object and converts it into a data table. So if you want to manipulate the data table format, the DOM, you could, of course, you can do this from the DT settings, but you can also come in here and just change these settings to however you want. So pretty much everything to manipulate the layout or the design of the data table can be found in here. And then the rest of this is just functions and miscellaneous stuff that hopefully you don't need to look at. CommonJS is where the rendering for parts is the changing of a web2py multi-select into the fancy multi-select that I just showed you, and some other functions that just make my life a bit easier. So they're sitting in there. The web2py.js is a file that comes with web2py, but it provides the flash functionality, or that little flash message that pops up. So I wanted to look a little bit different, so I've made some changes in here, pretty primitive changes. It just looks for some text in the message, like the word success or the word error, and then changes the color depending on that to make it a bit more beautiful, and also closes it automatically. So standard flash dialog, so we call it a dialog, it just stays until you click on it, whereas this one will close. If it's not an error, it will flash up and then disappear. Okay, the common functions, this is basically my Python common functions. I log an error, or whenever there is an error code, and that's for the error trapping in many of the functions. So I'll just push that out into its own little Python file. So common functions and CommonJS is basically the JavaScript common stuff, and this is the Python common stuff. This is where we looked at this file already, and this is the only file that you should need to change, and it allows you to configure the display of your tables however you like. So there's no reason why you can't have multiple entries for the one table. And if I can find one of those down here. So here I've got the card master table. I want to format in two different ways. And so I'm just looking for the data table name in either of those. There's some common things, but then the card master 2, I want to manipulate it a little bit differently. So I just change some of the settings, maybe overwrite the field setting here and specify an additional setting. So all you're doing is passing in some name. It doesn't need to be the table name. Some representation of that name. And then you can set the table name here. That's really important, of course. And if this name does not match this name, like this, and then all the other fields are optional. We've been through those in the other video. You could check that one out. And then this is all the smarts. So the show function is the main function, and it simply looks at the args that are passed in, usually the table name, and they're also variables as well. So if we're trying to filter a particular table in a special way, and then passes it off to the data table data function, and it gets back the DT settings object and sends that back to the view. The delete is pretty simple. The add just calls the add edit, as does the edit. And then this controls the building of the form, both the edit form and the adding form. This does some tricky stuff which I haven't looked at in any of the videos, but the uploading of a file doesn't work in an Ajax format, and I don't know enough about Ajax and stuff yet. All I know is that it said in the book that you couldn't upload a form using the standard web2py form. So this is my attempt at enabling the upload files, and it kind of does some tricky stuff by first looking to see whether there's any files in your dialog, and then calls this to upload the file first of all. So it kind of saves the file, and then it calls it a second time to try and process the form. So it definitely has worked. Not certain actually if it's working right now, but it's pretty close to working if it's not. And then there's a few things in here. This is where the form gets built. And again, it's just using the standard SQL, web2py SQL form, which is a really beautiful tool. This builds a list of fields that we want to disable, and those disabled fields get sent back to the view, and they get disabled in the view because there's some problems with disabling them here. And then this fills out the default values. So if a table is filtered, so there's the vars question mark field name equals 7, say, it works that out and then sets the default for that. So those defaults are already set when you view the form, processes the form, then bundles up the result in a JSON file and sends it back for processing. And I think, and then what do we got? And then data table data. This is where all the magic happens. So a few kind of miscellaneous functions. It builds HTML in this function. So the HTML it builds is actually the layout for the table. It's not the full table. It's the layout for the table. So the header and the footer and a few other bits and pieces. And the actual content of the table gets dumped in the view itself via JavaScript. I can't actually remember why I did it that way. I was building it all here and then I pulled it out for some reason. Anyhow, it seems to work fine. Temp database model, this actually builds a temporary table so that with all of the tables in the model so there's just a very simple table, and I then pass that in here and it builds that show page which lists all of the model tables so that you can just easily click on them. That all happens in here. And then this is where it goes through and processes all those settings. So there's a lot of stuff here. There's stuff that prepares the fields. Then it goes through and builds all the data. So this processes the records, and then it pops out of the back of that, and then it does some more stuff with the settings once that data has been built. And there was a reason for that a long time ago. I don't know if it's still a good reason. And then the key thing for the actual data table display is this column def data. There are multiple ways that you can configure columns in the data tables, and this is probably the more flexible of the options. So it builds a column def structure which it can then use in the view to configure the table. So setting the order by, setting the alignment, hiding fields, child fields, and so on. And then it returns that object. Okay, oh yeah, I didn't mention this before. You can reference a field just by wrapping in curly brackets. So curly bracket ID, lowercase ID, curly bracket, allows you to get the ID of that record. So if you want to use the ID, which you often want to do in a link, you can just include the field wrapped in curly brackets, and that'll give you what you want. And down here we've got the default. So in this table we're looking at our settings. We're kind of overriding the defaults. This is where all the defaults are set. So they're initially set, and then we call that table defaults, which is over here, to override these defaults. So our defaults overriding these defaults. One of a better way of describing that. And then it does some other stuff to try to look at what we've said and manipulate that a little bit, and then it returns that all those defaults back to the previous function, which then builds the data and the data table column defs and sends that back. Okay, well, that was a bit of an overview. Maybe that's helpful. I hope it is. Okay, cheers.